Hello, everyone. I am back again discussing further the topic of the Lilith versus Eve and a continuation of discussions relating to the Superbowl halftime show with Shakira and JLo. Oh my. The discussions continue. I get a lot of information off of some Facebook interchanges. And that being said, this whole topic of how women dress and indicating, I guess, whether they are, quote unquote, a hoe, you know, I guess that means someone who's highly interested, a woman who's highly interested in sex, or maybe has many sexual partners. Um, it's very interesting because in the discussions, it seems like there needs to be a distinction between the um, women maybe who are open to sex and those who are not. And this comes down to the issue of patriarchy. And as I mentioned in my previous video, is the fact that the whole story of demonizing the powerful, independent, sexual woman is part of patriarchy. And this is what I really, really want to address in this video, is to just re-emphasize how we have been taught to believe that there is the Virgin Mary, who's pure, who conceived, Jesus Christ through, without sex, and then you have kind of Mary Magdalene, who's the prostitute, the whore, um, that symbolizes also Lilith, the Lilith versus Eve, the Virgin Mary versus Mary Magdalene, concept or an idea. And but this was something sort of created and maintained by patriarchy in order to uplift the masculine and to downplay or devalue the feminine. Now, I had mentioned in my book there was a purpose of this. The purpose was when it's in order to elevate consciousness. It's a whole process of which to elevate consciousness. First we had matriarchy, then we had patriarchy followed, and now we're in a time period of egalitarianism where we're trying to figure out to balance both masculine and feminine energy and to move forward with both the positive aspects of the masculine and feminine. So therefore, we're both conscious in our expression of the masculine and the feminine, which we were not before. So, so some of these stories, let's say that there were two different types of women, had to be developed, and maintained, by the religious system, because there are many different religions, but they all sort of maintain this. Now, there are, again, as I mentioned before, different expressions, higher expressions of sexuality and lower expressions of sexuality based on the consciousness of the individual, both men and women, and that affects how, in some ways, how promiscuous someone is, or how much they're not. Now, it depends on their level of consciousness. If they're really low, but they're holding back and restricting, that's going to also cut off life source, and that's going to be very restrictive, and that's not really natural for that level of consciousness. As well as, you could say a promiscuous expression of sexuality is also not necessarily positive, but it is a process by which you learn, oh, you know what, it's better to be more selective. That having sex with many people leaves you empty. But people have to go through that process of learning it. And we're all here in this world at different stages of consciousness in the various areas of the instincts, which I discuss in my book. And so, and sex is one of those instincts. And so there are different people at different levels of consciousness through the spectrum in this world that exist in this world. So you're going to have people of lower consciousness, You could say if there's level one, two, three, four, and five, you're gonna have people at all these different levels interacting with one another, and typically, people of the same level interact with each other, and then eventually, sometimes people learn and they move to the next level, within a given lifetime. But there are more people at the lower levels than there are at the higher levels of consciousness. So, and part of that is also to promulgate the human race. I mean, there is a purpose beyond just pleasure of having sex, and that is to promulgate the human race and to keep us going, to have, keep the cycle, because that cycle keeps us, existing, but it also gives our souls new opportunities as new babies are born, as people die and new babies are born, to come into this world and continue the cycle of reincarnation. So there is a lot so you don't want to downplay or to be negative. And so in the aspect of expression of sexuality, right? Because it has a purpose not beyond the pleasure. And that's one, that for instance that we want to learn is that there is pleasure to be had, but then there's also, higher levels of expression of sexuality, right? So, um, but to demonize the powerful, sexual independent woman was to control the woman and to downplay the feminine in order to, in essence, bring about the dominance of the masculine, uh, qualities or energy in the world, right? As I mentioned earlier, was had to do with property rights as well. So, um, so in this, there's so many antiquated ways of viewing things. Um, when we're saying that, if a woman dresses provocatively, then it's confusing to a man, whether, of what type of woman she is. And so this is just a point. The point, what I'm saying is that, it may have historically been that there was a type of woman, because women too believe the lie, believe the truth with an expiration date, right? So they believed it, that there were two different types of women, either one or the other. And sometimes what kept women locked in some of these lower vibrations of sexuality and expression of the feminine, and was the shame and was the guilt, they felt from being in these lower vibrations. And so the point, if we could get past this shame and past the guilt of being sexual, then we can move up through the levels of consciousness and into a higher expression of sexuality in general. Because um, sex can also be, how can I say, a very base activity, but it also can be, a sacred act that leads to spiritual enlightenment. So, and what is the difference? The difference is consciousness. With very little consciousness, it's a very base animalistic act. With higher consciousness, it's a sacred, uh, conscious building, connecting to the divine, activity. And so you don't want to make it dirty. You don't want to make it nasty. You don't want to make it, embarrassing. You don't want to make it any of those things, because in the end, um, at higher levels of consciousness, can be a very positive act and means in gaining enlightenment, depending on the person. Um, because it will depend on the person, because there's some people who, if they restricted heavily in their sexuality throughout their many past lives, then it is very likely that a possible means to gaining spiritual enlightenment will come through sexuality. However, if there's people who have, overindulged in sexuality and maybe have misused it a great deal, then their path to enlightenment, to wholeness, or to salvation, or out of the cycle of reincarnation, however you would like to describe it, can then come from restricting sexually. So it really depends on the person and the life, the how can I say, the pattern of the lives that they have lived, with regards to what's going to bring them, into wholeness. So because we all have to have the entire experience of being a human being, on this earth, and of mastering the different aspects of of being human, and that includes mastery of the instinctual drives that we are all created with from the very beginning. And so, and sex is one of them. So I'm hoping that this, show is was really this show was really powerful in bringing that to the forefront, that the powerful, sexual independent woman, raised a lot of fears in a lot of people. It was shocking, but it needed to be shocked, and you needed to awaken that fear in order to address it, to let it go, so we can move beyond that. And so that's kind of what I want to say in this video, is just that, sexuality can also be a tool to spiritual enlightenment depending on your prior path. For some people, again, like I said, it could be complete restriction. If you've overindulged in many of your past lives in sexuality, then it may be, your path may be to restrict. Okay, so it just really depends, and that's my point. Because in Christianity, in Judaism and Islam, there's so much emphasis on the restriction of the sexuality, and that being celibate, or just having sex to procreate kids, in some ways is, it's the goal. It's the gold standard, right? And although it can be, it's not necessarily that way for all people. And this is what I want to say. There's been so many religious rules that are taught, and they're not necessarily the same for all people. For instance, if they all, how can I say, are valued at one different point in time. So if you're restricted early in your incarnations and say weren't a very sexual person, then you'll need to come into your sexuality in order to be enlightenment. So it just depends on what stage you're at, where you started out. That's what I want to be clear, is that where you started out in some of these areas. It's that, if you started out heavily, in sexual activity, and that was a great part of your experience, it may be that your path is to restrict. At some point, you need to restrict. But if you did it at the beginning, then your path is to reconnect with your sexuality, and that may be your path to enlightenment. On the opposite side, it could be that you overindulge, and therefore you need to restrict in order to get to higher levels of consciousness, and in essence to come into wholeness, right? So it really depends. And so that's kind of the message I also want to tell people, is that you don't know somebody's story. You don't know their story. You don't know what they're working at. And maybe that expression is something that person needs to do in order, in essence, yes, to evolve spiritually. And so but you don't know that person's story. And so that's why you need to not judge people, because you don't know, they don't know your story, and you don't know their story. And you need to know that everybody, is in essence, working on themselves and doing the best they can with where they're at. And so that's the main point, is that not to judge people, because your story is different from someone else, and all you need to do is pay attention to what your story is. What do you need to work on, and how do you need to do, what are your next steps and areas where you need to focus your energy and attention to evolve and transform, in order to continue down the path of true wholeness or transformation, that will lead you to oneness with the divine, and return to the source of creation. So you have your own path. Someone else has their own path, and we need to realize that, come to that acceptance that there are different paths, and that's okay. And so, and that we're all in process in working on ourselves to get, to those higher levels of consciousness, and to come into wholeness. So, so that's really what this video is about, is just, sort of not judging people, and coming into terms with sexuality, and being comfortable with a strong, powerful sexual woman, and that and to understand that the myth of the virgin, um, huh? Okay, let's stick on my teeth. But the myth of the virgin versus the whore, or Lilith versus Eve, it was a story. and that we needed to believe, but that it is a truth whose or story that has reached its expiration date, and so that it was never really true. It was never really true. It was never true, really. It's just that we had to believe it. That's what's called a belief. We had to believe it in order to sort of move through uh, the masculine and consciousness, the development of the masculine as dominant over the feminine during patriarchy. But that too was in essence, a lie, right? Because the feminine and masculine are in fact equal, right? So uh, so that it was a lie that we had to promulgate, but it helped to evolve humanity and ourselves, the individuals within that experience to grow spiritually. So yeah, so those are the main lessons that there are things that we beliefs that we held and that we were taught that were not really explained thoroughly. They weren't explained in their completeness, and they applied to different people at different times. And so that's kind of what I really, really want to get at, is that the beliefs and things that we hold, maybe there is some truth to it, but they apply to different people at different times. And so the important thing is to focus on your own journey and not judge other people negatively. So that's and to embrace, that your own sexuality and in a healthy expression, of your own sexuality, but that there should not be shame, assigned to that. So that's the message that I would like to leave people with today, is um, to realize that beliefs are beliefs and they serve a purpose, but then there also comes a time when we need to move beyond that as we learn new information. So that's what I'm hoping to share with you guys through these videos, is new information to unlearn some of those, what they call limiting beliefs. That's one of the things that I did learn, in Kabbalah, is about our limiting beliefs. To one of the prayers that they say is called the Anabako, and it's to uh, disentangle, from my limited and limiting beliefs, So, so I think that's really the main thing, is that we've come to a time where we need to unlearn some of those beliefs and realize, yeah, they served a purpose, but now it's time to move on to newer ways to reintegrate. Now we're bringing in all these opposites. We're bringing things into balance, and we're trying to re I guess reintegrate, rebalance all these different energies, both masculine and feminine, and that requires unlearning some of the things that we've been taught. So I will have more videos on the unlearning of many things that we've been taught through our traditional, religion. And so, if you have any questions, please, you can email me, or you can post comments below, and I will try to respond. Thank you.